his career, Henry repeatedly showed a capacity for swift and violent action. He caused two of his own granddaughters to be blinded in retaliation for their father's treatment of hostages, and in 1124-5 he had all the moneyers in England mutilated without trial, to discourage their successors from falsifying the coinage. He seems to have been naturally both cruel and avaricious. All the same, this heavy hand checked lawlessness in all parts of his kingdom, and although a much more calculating character than Rufus, he had the knack of winning admiration and even trust. Henry reigned for the most part in peace. In 1106, however, he defeated his older brother, Robert of Normandy, in an unexpectedly decisive battle at Tinchebray, seized his duchy and imprisoned him for the rest of Robert's life. One of Henry's first acts as king was to marry a descendant of Alfred the Great, a match with obvious dynastic overtones. Of his 3 legitimate children, one died in infancy, another, William, was drowned at sea, and the third was a daughter, Matilda, whom Henry married to the German Emperor, Henry V. He therefore left a confused and problematic succession at his death in 1135. Stephen, 1135 to 1154, born in 1104, crowned at Westminster, buried in Faversham. Henry I attempted to bind his barons to accepting his daughter Matilda as his heiress, but in December 1135 it was Henry's much-loved nephew, Count Stephen of Blois, who was acclaimed and crowned king. Stephen is a fascinating character. His charm, geniality, dash and bravery made him almost universally popular, but he was also particularly unsuccessful in sustaining action of almost any sort, and repeatedly showed a streak of tricky unreliability. He is best summed up in a story told by the chronicler William of Malmesbury, who relates how Stephen led an ambush for the Earl of Gloucester, failed in the attempt, and then tried to laugh it off by a genial countenance and an unsolicited confession. Stephen's rule was promptly challenged by Matilda, the Empress, as she was still commonly known, although her first husband had died in 1125. She had been remarried in 1128 to Count Geoffrey of Anjou. Matilda commanded enough support and enjoyed sufficient resources to throw Stephen's kingdom into turmoil, but neither party could muster the strength for a decisive blow. In 1141, Stephen was captured at Lincoln, but his queen, also confusingly called Matilda, succeeded in a lucky counterstroke which brought about his release, and in 1142 the Empress was forced to make a dramatic escape through the snow from Oxford. When the Empress retired from active campaigning, her son Henry took up the struggle. For much of Stephen's reign, but especially between 1139 and 1145, there was anarchy in England. When Stephen's son Eustace died before his father, it was probably a relief for all concerned that the succession should be firmly settled on the young Henry. Henry II, 1154 to 1189, born 1133, crowned at Westminster and buried at Fontevraud. Henry II has been described as one of the most remarkable characters in English history. empires of Europe as Richard I. Richard was the complete cosmopolitan military adventurer, tough, glamorous, a brilliant general, and a restless wanderer. As a king of England, he was a disaster. He spent only 2 short spells in the country, one of 3 months and one of 2. Otherwise, he was campaigning in France, Sicily, and Palestine, where in 1191 he fought his way to within 12 miles of Jerusalem. England paid for his exploits and paid again in 1192 when he was captured at Vienna on his way back from the Crusade. He died of a wound sustained largely through carelessness in 1199. He was a homosexual and left no son. John, 1199 to 1216. Born in 1167, crowned in Westminster, buried at Worcester. It fell to Richard's only surviving brother John to meet the series of internal upheavals and external assaults which almost inevitably assailed the unmanageably vast empire of Henry II. He faced these challenges with indomitable vigour and much ability, but fought a losing battle and died in the shadow of failure. In John's attempt to maintain his position, he rode roughshod over the church and many of the nobility. His clash with the clergy caused England to be placed under papal interdict between 1208 and 1214, and involved John in excommunication from 1209 to 1213. Subsequently, however, the Pope became John's closest ally. A rebellious faction of the nobility forced John in 1215 to concede at Runnymede, near Windsor, a list of privileges which has achieved almost legendary status as Magna Carta. The cornerstone of English liberties was how subsequent generations came to see it, though the fact of the kings being forced to make concessions was more important than the concessions themselves. John's reputation has been radically affected by the outcome of these quarrels, and he has received less than his due for his abilities as a brilliant commander in land warfare, an imaginative pioneer of naval defence, and an inventive and energetic administrator. John's greatest problem was the disloyalty of his barons. The lords of John's French lands were bound to develop French rather than English allegiances, and it can be argued that in losing Normandy, John clarified the future for the Kingdom of England. Henry III, 1216 to 1272. Born in 1207, crowned in Gloucester, buried at Westminster. The reign of Henry III saw constitutional developments of the utmost importance. These came about more because of the weaknesses of the king than because of his strengths. Throughout his reign, noble factions struggled for control over the crown. Under the pressure 1265, however, Henry's son Edward turned the tables at Evesham, where the barons were defeated and Montfort was killed. Henry had an exalted view of his royal status, while lacking the force and talents to make good his claims. He loved splendour and display, but lacked judgment and asserted himself more obstinately than shrewdly. He greatly admired Edward the Confessor, whom he somewhat resembled. He was conspicuously pious, rebuilt Westminster Abbey, and named his only son Edward. Edward the First, 1272 to 1307, born in 1239, crowned at Westminster, buried at Westminster. Edward the First might be taken as a pattern of the medieval king. He is remembered on the whole for his achievements rather than by his personality. Tall, strong and handsome in figure, he was magnificently royal in presence, clear and emphatic in speech, forceful and enterprising in action. He was uncertain in temper, but reasonable in counsel. Above all, he attempted to live by the ideal of Christian knighthood, devoutly gallant and heroically chivalrous. There was little of the fanatic in Edward. He was a pragmatic Englishman who was formidable under stress and disliked muddle at all times, but who was happiest on horseback with his dogs at his heels and a hawk on his wrist. The turbulent princes of Wales, under the new leader, Llewellyn, were defeated and brought to order in the first 10 years of Edward's reign. By the Statute of Wales, 1284, the principality was finally annexed to the English crown. As a gesture of reconciliation, the king's newborn son was proclaimed Prince of Wales at Carnarvon Castle, and the title has been held by successive heirs to the throne ever since. Edward's attempt to assert his overlordship of the Scots was complicated elsewhere by French attacks on his Gascon possessions. Although he secured considerable success in Scotland in 1296 and again in 1298, when he defeated Wallace at Falkirk and carried off the Scottish coronation stone of Scone, Scottish resistance continued under the leadership of Robert Bruce. The Hammer of the Scots, as Edward had become known, died in 1307 as he moved north on yet another campaign. Apart from his achievements in strengthening the unity of what became Great Britain, Edward was a powerful and effective lawgiver. He was also a formidable administrator, a great builder, and a statesman of European reputation. It is hardly surprising that in later years his reign came to take on almost the quality of a golden age. Edward II, 1307 to his fame led to developments of lasting significance in the fields of state administration and the relationship between Crown and Parliament, which granted the essential taxes. Edward III was less of a lawgiver than his grandfather, but his achievements make him no less important as a builder of the English state. Edward won sea battles against France at Sluys, 1340, and Castile off Winchelsea, 1350. He defeated the Scots at Halidon Hill, 1333, and his army beat them again, even more decisively at Neville's Cross, 1345, while he was himself in France. He wrote the names of two of the greatest of English battle honours at Crecy, 1346, and Poitiers, 1356. The King of Scotland was captured at Neville's Cross, the King of France at Poitiers, and Edward shone forth as the greatest warrior of Western Europe. It was while he was at the peak of his career as a leader of chivalry that he founded the Order of the Knights of the Garter in 1348. The second half of the reign was a sadder story. The plague of the Black Death struck England in 1348-9, killing roughly one-third of the population within 10 years and radically altering society. At the same time, the tide of war turned against English arms, both at sea and on land, and Edward himself lapsed into a slack and ineffectual dotage, in which he was incapable of resisting the turbulence of his parliament. He was old for a medieval king, but it was a sad and degrading end. Richard II, 1377 to 1399, born 1367, crowned at Westminster, buried in Langley and reburied Westminster. Edward, the Black Prince, the famous son of Edward III, died before his father, and it was a child of 10 who succeeded to the throne in 1377. Richard's reign began in a confusion that deepened into crisis. After a central period of relative calm, events slid again into civil war. The king's personality had much to do with his difficulties, at least at the latter end, but European society itself was diseased in this period of the Black Death, as the Speaker of the House of Commons recognised, when in 1381 he voiced the fear that the whole kingdom will be lost and utterly destroyed forever, and our Lord the King and the Lords and Commons along with it. The first great crisis of the reign was the peasant revolt in 1381. It was an episode that looked back to innumerable riots of the desperate and starving, but also forward to modern political revolutions. The boy king showed extraordinary bravery and self-control in calming the mob in a moment of the most intense danger at Smithfield, and their threat receded. The aristocracy were as ordered as the peasantry, and the later 1380s saw a round of bitter fighting which was checked only when Richard seized power for possibility of continuing with Richard II than any consideration of right. Hopes expressed at its accession for a time of order and the rule of law were to be disappointed. The years to 1405 were plagued by uprisings, particularly in Wales and the north, and although all in turn were defeated, they created a turbulence which persisted long after the great battles, such as Shrewsbury, 1403, had been lost and won. Indeed, the names of the leading rebels, Owen Glendower and Henry Percy, Harry Hotspur, have passed with Shakespeare's help into popular imagination. Henry was beset by financial difficulties. His frequent demands that Parliament should give help in the form of taxes opened the door to long discussions about grievances, which sometimes led to intense wranglings full of significance for the future of the Constitution. Henry himself was a tough warrior and a shrewd manager of men, but as Maurice Keene remarks, no one regretted his days when they were over. When contrasted with the courtly splendours of his cousin, Richard II, or the military glories of his son, Henry V, his reign lacks ambition and achievement. Henry V, 1413 to 1422, born in 1387, crowned in Westminster, buried at Westminster. Henry V is unrivalled among the late medieval kings of England for both success and sheer ability. This was a distinction made all the more impressive by the fact that his riotous youth meant that all the achievements were ground into the 9 years of his short reign. He embodied so completely the ideal qualities of medieval kingship that it is tempting to describe him as a symbol of the entire era. The more so that this finest flower of knighthood was practically the last of his line. Henry's devotion to chivalrous combat, his orthodox piety, even his concept of kingly justice, were about to be superseded by the warfare of gunpowder, the reformation of religion, and the statecraft of the Renaissance. The central fact of Henry's reign was the conquest of France. The internal troubles of the French kingdom gave Henry a chance to reassert claims inherited from the Plantagenets. In 2 great expeditions, 1415 and 1417 to 18, England's continental empire were briefly restored. At Agincourt in October 1415, the French chivalry were mown down in swathes by English archers as the French attempted to sweep over Henry's trapped and outnumbered forces. In the later expedition, a campaign of ruthlessly organised sieges subdued the cities of Normandy and returned that duchy to the English crown. The climax of Henry's success was reached with the Treaty of Troyes in 1420. By this treaty, he took his wife, Catherine of Valois, daughter of the French king, Charles VI, and was assured of the reversion of the French throne to England after Charles's death. Fortune, however, prevented it. Henry V died of dysentery on his 3rd campaigning expedition in 1422, and was just outlived by the feeble Charles VI of France. Henry's son proved to be as weak as his father had been strong. Henry VI, 1422 to 1461 and 1470 to 71, born 1421, crowned at creation of ordered communities in which men could follow regular lives devoted to the pursuit of truth and beauty. So he founded Eton and King's College, Cambridge, lost all his father's conquests in France, and failed to stop England sliding into the terrible convulsions of the Wars of the Roses. The king's feebleness, though central, was not the whole of the story. The French, formerly demoralised, were rallied by Joan of Arc in 1429, and the diplomacy of the Continental War was radically altered by a change of alliances in 1435. At home, the decay of feudalism that filled England with armed men bearing the badges of rival lords posed problems of enormous size and complexity. Whatever the causes of